The telegram arrived in Chelyabinsk in the dead of night. It came directly from Moscow, stamped with the highest priority of the State Defense Committee. The message was brief, brutal, and terrifying. It demanded a tiger killer, and it gave the engineers at the Kirov plant, known to the world as Tankograd, exactly 25 days to produce it. In normal engineering terms, 25 days is not enough time to design a car door handle, let alone a 45-ton armored fighting vehicle. But in the winter of 1943, normal did not exist. The Nazis were preparing for summer, and if the Red Army didn't have a counter to the Tiger, the war might be lost. Joseph Kotin, the legendary Soviet tank designer, gathered his team in a freezing office. The blueprints of the Tiger tank lay on the table like a death sentence. The existing Soviet tank guns, the 76mm and even the 85mm, were simply too weak to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. They would need a weapon of immense power. Developing a new ballistic cannon would take 6 months. They had 3 weeks. Kotin looked at his exhausted team and proposed an idea that bordered on insanity. If they couldn't build a new anti-tank gun in time, they wouldn't use one. Instead, they would take the most violent weapon in the Soviet arsenal, the 152mm ML-20 howitzer, and bolt it directly onto a tank chassis. The room fell silent. The ML-20 was not a tank gun. It was heavy artillery. It was designed to shatter concrete bunkers and level city blocks from miles away. It fired a high explosive shell that weighed nearly 50 kilograms. The recoil alone was enough to flip a light vehicle. "We will not build a tank," Kotin explained. "We will build a self-propelled gun. No turret. We mount the gun fixed in the hull. We strip everything unnecessary. We make it a mobile bunker." The project was codenamed Object 236. The clock started ticking. The design bureau transformed into a prison of their own making. Designers stopped going home. They slept on wooden benches in the drafting room, covered in sheepskin coats. Meals were brought to the tables. The line between day and night dissolved. The engineering challenges were nightmares. The massive breech of the howitzer took up almost the entire crew compartment. The recoil force was 30 tons, enough to shear the transmission apart. To solve the balance issues, the designers had to act on instinct rather than calculation. There is a famous story from those 25 frantic days that illustrates the desperation. The prototype hull was ready, but the actual ML-20 gun had not yet arrived from the artillery factory. The engineers needed to test the suspension immediately. If the nose was too heavy, the tank would bog down in the mud. They couldn't wait. So, they calculated the exact weight of the gun and poured a massive block of concrete. They strapped this gray slab to the front of the tank and drove it around the snowy test track. It worked. The suspension held. Down on the factory floor, the atmosphere was electric. Welders worked until their eyes bled. Machinists turned parts for a machine that didn't even have finished blueprints yet. The NKVD officers watched from the shadows, reminding everyone of the consequences of failure. But the workers didn't need threats. Many had sons at the front. They knew what the Tigers were doing to them. On the 25th day, the doors of the assembly shop opened. Through the steam and the smoke, a monster emerged. It was ugly, it was squat. It looked like a brutal iron box with a telephone pole sticking out of the front. It lacked the elegance of the T-34, but it possessed a terrifying aura of raw power. Object 236 revved its engine. The 25-day miracle was complete. They had successfully mated a heavy artillery piece to a tank chassis in less time than it takes to cure concrete. Now, they just had to prove to Stalin that this Frankenstein's monster could actually fight. The design bureau at Tankograd had become a place where time did not exist. There was no day or night, only the relentless white glare of the factory lamps and the ticking of the clock. The deadline set by Moscow was absolute: 25 days. For the engineers and the workers on the assembly floor, this was not just a job, it was a siege. Lead designer Joseph Kotin moved his bed into the factory. He didn't leave the building for 3 weeks. The welders, Many of them women and teenagers who had replaced the men sent to the front, slept on piles of rags next to their machines, waking up only to drink boiling water and return to the steel. The challenge was physical as much as it was intellectual. They were attempting to force a marriage between two machines that were never meant to touch. The KV-1S chassis was a tank-cramped mobile designed for a turret. The ML-20 howitzer was a beast of artillery, massive, heavy, with a recoil that could snap a telephone pole. To fit the gun, they had to cut the tank open. There was no time for a rotating turret. Instead, they built a heavy, armored box, a casemate, directly onto the hull. It was crude, but it was strong. The gun breech was so large, it took up almost the entire crew compartment. The loader would have to wrestle 50-kilogram shells in a space the size of a closet, while the gun commander sat practically straddling the massive barrel. The tension reached its peak on the issue of balance. The ML-20 was front-heavy. If the calculations were wrong, the tank would tip forward, burying its nose in the mud, rendering it useless. They needed to test the suspension, but the guns hadn't arrived from the artillery plant yet. In a moment of desperate ingenuity, the engineers did something legendary. They calculated the exact weight of the gun system and poured a massive block of concrete. They strapped this gray slab to the front of the chassis and ordered the test driver to take it out. The tank roared around the snowy proving grounds, fighting the weight of the concrete gun. It held. The suspension didn't break. The concrete breach had saved the project. Inside the factory, the NKVD officers paced the catwalks. They didn't need to say a word. Everyone knew the penalty for failure. Sabotage was a loose term in 1943, and missing a deadline by an hour could be interpreted as treason. But the fear of the secret police paled in comparison to the hatred of the enemy. Every worker had a story, a father killed in Kyiv, a brother lost in Stalingrad. They were building this machine to kill the tigers that were killing their families. On the final night, the welding torches hissed until dawn. The paint was still wet when the engine was turned over. The air in the factory filled with blue smoke. On the 25th day, exactly as ordered, the doors opened. The prototype, Object 236, rolled out into the Russian winter. It was a terrifying machine to behold. It lacked the sleek lines of the T-34. It was a squat, angry metal box with a gun so large it looked comical until you realized what it could do. It was a hammer, forged in a panic, ready to strike. The exhausted workers watched it go, their faces blackened with soot, knowing they had just birthed the monster that might save them all. The factory floor of Chelyabinsk was no longer a place of industry. It was a front line. Inside the cavernous assembly halls of Plant No. 100, the concept of time had dissolved. There was no morning, no evening. There was only the white glare of the arc lamps and the relentless countdown. The task was technically absurd. They were attempting a forced marriage of two machines that had no business being together. The chassis was the KV-1S, a heavy tank designed for mobility and armor. The weapon was the ML-20, a 152mm howitzer artillery piece that weighed nearly 3 tons and was designed to sit in a field, anchored to the earth, firing miles behind the lines. To put this massive cannon inside a tank was an engineering nightmare. The breech of the gun alone, the part where the shell is loaded, was the size of a refrigerator. Joseph Cotten, the chief designer, moved his cot into the drafting room. He did not leave the building. Around him, the Tankograd workforce, a mix of exhausted men, determined women, and teenagers standing on crates to reach the lathes, worked in a trance-like state. The temperature inside the factory often dropped below freezing. Metal stuck to skin, but no one stopped. The engineering solution was brutal in its simplicity. Since a rotating turret could never handle the recoil of the 152mm gun without ripping the tank apart, they abandoned it. Instead, they cut the top off the tank hull and welded a massive, fixed steel box in its place, an armored casemate. It was less like building a vehicle and more like welding a submarine conning tower onto a tractor. The tension peaked around day 15. The hull was ready, but the actual guns had not yet arrived from the artillery factory in Perm. The timeline was collapsing. They needed to test the suspension immediately. The engineers feared that the massive weight of the gun would crush the front road wheels, making the tank drive with its nose in the dirt. In a moment of desperate ingenuity that became a legend of the Great Patriotic War, the team improvised. They calculated the exact weight of the gun and its mount. Then, they poured a massive, crude block of concrete. They chained this gray slab to the front of the tank chassis and ordered the test driver to take it out into the snow. It was a surreal sight. A headless tank driving furiously around the test track, fighting the weight of a concrete ghost gun. But the suspension held. The tracks did not snap. The gamble paid off. Back inside, the human cost of the 25 days was visible in the eyes of the welders. They slept in shifts of 4 hours, curled up on piles of rags near the warm engines. The NKVD officers watched from the catwalks, but the threats were unnecessary. The motivation wasn't fear of Stalin, it was hatred of the tiger. Every worker knew that the Germans were preparing something terrible for the summer, and this ugly machine was the only thing that could stop it. On the final night, the first genuine ML-20 gun was lowered by crane into the chassis. It was a tight fit. The clearance between the gun recoil mechanism and the driver's head was measured in centimeters. It was claustrophobic, loud, and rough. But on the 25th day, exactly as the ultimatum demanded, the engine coughed and roared to life. Blue smoke filled the assembly hall. Object 236 moved under its own power. It was not a beautiful machine. It was squat, boxy, and possessed a barrel so large it looked disproportionate, like a caricature of a tank. But as it rolled out into the biting wind of the Urals, the exhausted workers didn't see an ugly duckling. They saw a predator. The beast had been mated, and it was hungry. The journey from Chelyabinsk to Moscow was as dangerous as the design process itself. Object 236 was loaded onto a special flatbed train car, covered in heavy tarpaulins, and guarded by a detachment of NKVD troops, who were ordered to shoot anyone who showed too much curiosity. The train tore through the Russian winter, bypassing standard schedules, carrying the only weapon in the Soviet Union capable of answering the German Tigers. When the prototype arrived in Moscow, it was driven directly to the Kremlin. It was a surreal scene. The cobblestones of the Kremlin courtyard, usually reserved for limousines and marching guards, now trembled under the weight of 45 tons of raw steel. The tank looked out of place. It was dirty, covered in the soot of the factory and the grime of the railway. Its welds were rough, scarring the metal like healed wounds. It did not look like a parade vehicle. It looked like a brawler. Joseph Kotin stood by the tracks, his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the anticipation. He knew who was coming. In the Soviet Union, engineering was a matter of life and death. If Stalin liked the machine, you were a hero. If he found a flaw, you could disappear. The heavy wooden doors opened. Joseph Stalin walked out, accompanied by his inner circle, Molotov, Beria, and Voroshilov. The Supreme Commander was dressed in his simple gray greatcoat. He walked slowly, circling the machine, puffing on his pipe. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. The only sound was the crunch of snow under Stalin's boots. He stopped in front of the gun. The 152mm barrel loomed over him, a dark, gaping tunnel of destruction. It was comically large for a vehicle of that size. It looked less like a tank gun and more like a ship's cannon that had been ripped off a destroyer and glued to a tractor. Stalin turned to Kotin. "Does it drive?" he asked quietly. "Yes, Comrade Stalin," Kotin replied. "Does it shoot?" "It obliterates, Comrade Stalin." Stalin nodded and did something unexpected. He climbed onto the engine deck. He peered into the open hatch of the casemate. He saw the cramped interior, the massive breech of the gun that took up almost all the space, the lack of a turret, the crude periscopes. It was a nightmare for a crew to operate. It was claustrophobic, deafening, and uncomfortable. But Stalin wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for a counterpunch. He climbed down and looked Kotin in the eye. Legend says that one of the generals tried to point out that the vehicle had limited visibility and a slow rate of fire, Stalin cut him off with a wave of his pipe. He patted the thick steel of the hull. "It is not elegant," Stalin reportedly said, his voice raspy. "It is rough. But the enemy we face is arrogant. They have built a machine of precision. This," he gestured to the massive howitzer, "this is a brutal argument, and it is the only argument the German beasts will understand." He turned to the waiting scribe. "Accept it into service immediately." In that moment, Object 236 ceased to exist. Stalin renamed it the ***U100 and 52***. There were no more trials, no more committees. The order was given to turn Tankograd into a dedicated assembly line for these monsters. The prototype was not even allowed to cool down. It was sent immediately to the proving grounds to train the first crews. As Stalin walked back into the warmth of the Kremlin, the engineers let out a breath they had been holding for 25 days. They had survived the deadline. They had survived the inspection. Now, the Su-152 had to survive the war. The brutal argument was officially part of the Red Army, and it was heading straight for a place called Kursk. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk. The earth trembled under the treads of 3,000 German tanks. Operation Citadel had begun, and Hitler had bet everything on his new menagerie of steel monsters: the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand. The German crews were confident. They sat behind 100 millimeters of hardened Krupp steel, believing they were invincible. Their guns could kill a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. As they rolled across the dry, dusty steppes, they expected the Soviet shells to bounce off them like hail on a tin roof. But lurking in the tall grass, waiting in ambush positions, were the products of the 25-day miracle. The 1,541st Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment had arrived, equipped with 12 of the new Su-152 seconds. The engagement that followed changed the psychology of the Eastern Front forever. When the first Tiger commander spotted the low, squat silhouette of the Soviet machine, he likely didn't panic. It looked crude. It had no turret. It was slow. But then, the Su-152 fired. The physics of a 152mm shell hitting a tank are terrifying. The shell weighed nearly 50 kilograms, the weight of a grown woman. Unlike standard anti-tank rounds, which tried to drill a small hole through the armor, the 152mm high explosive round didn't need to penetrate. Witness accounts describe the impact as a catastrophe. When the shell struck a Tiger, it didn't just ding the armor. The kinetic energy was so massive that it often sheared the bolts holding the German turret in place. There are photographs from Kursk showing Tiger tanks with their turrets completely blown off, not by an internal explosion, but by the sheer force of the Soviet shell hitting them. Even if the armor held, the concussion inside turned the German tank into a bell. The shockwave would liquefy the crew's internal organs or cause the interior steel to shatter into shrapnel, killing everyone inside without ever piercing the hull. Major Sankovsky, commanding one of the Su-152 batteries, became a legend in a single afternoon. His crew destroyed 10 German tanks in one day. The German radio chatter turned from arrogance to panic. They called out warnings about a new devil that could crack a Tiger open like a ripe melon. The Soviet infantry, watching from their trenches, cheered. They had spent 2 years terrified of the German tanks. Now they saw the Tigers burning. They watched as the pride of the Wehrmacht was reduced to scrap metal by the crude, ugly hammer forged in Chelyabinsk. It was there, in the dust and smoke of Kursk, that the machine earned its name. It wasn't called the Su-152 by the troops. They looked at the burning carcasses of the tigers, panthers, and elephants, the German animals, and they gave the tank a new title: Zveroboy, the Beast Slayer, the Animal Hunter. The 25 days of sleeplessness, the frozen fingers in the factory, the concrete test blocks, and Stalin's brutal argument it had all led to this moment. The gamble had paid off. The Su-152 proved that you didn't need sophisticated optics or elegant engineering to win a tank battle. Sometimes you just needed a bigger gun. As the smoke cleared over Kursk, the myth of German invincibility lay broken on the steppe. The beast slayer had done its job. The hunters had become the hunted, and the road to Berlin was finally open.